American fighter jets may soon fly into Canadian airspace more often, not because of a sudden crisis, not because a war has started, but because a new warning is coming from Washington that is sending shockwaves through Ottawa. According to public comments now making headlines, the message from the U.S. side is being framed like this. If Canada steps away from its plan to buy 88 American-made F-35 fighter jets, the way North America defends itself could be changed. And here's the part that feels hard to ignore. This is no longer sounding like normal back-and-forth talks between allies. To many observers, it's starting to sound like pressure. And the reason people are reacting so strongly is because of what the U.S. ambassador to Canada reportedly said on the record, that if Canada doesn't follow through on the F-35 purchase, NORAD, the joint defense system that has protected the continent for decades, may have to be altered. Altered. That word matters. Because NORAD isn't just some small agreement. It's the core of how the U.S. and Canada track threats in the skies and respond fast, often with whichever aircraft is closest, no matter which country the plane belongs to. So why is Canada even thinking about changing course? Because the price has surged. Reports suggest what was once expected to cost around $19 billion has now jumped to about $27.7 billion. And that's a massive increase, nearly half more than the earlier estimate. And that's before adding the extra billions that would be needed to actually operate the jets: training, support systems, maintenance, secure facilities, and more. Analysts believe the overall bill could keep climbing as delays continue and construction costs rise, so Canada is looking at a deal that is getting more expensive before the jets even arrive. Then the ambassador's warning went further. He reportedly said that if Canada does not deliver this capability, the United States would likely need to buy more F-35s for its own forces and fly them more often into Canadian airspace to cover incoming threats approaching the U.S. In simple terms, the argument is, if Canada won't provide the jets, the U.S. will fill the gap. But to many Canadians and to many people watching from the outside, that raises a tough question. If your closest ally says, buy these jets or we'll operate in your airspace more anyway, how does that feel? Because Canadian airspace is still Canadian airspace. And this is why the story doesn't stop with the F-35. Canada has reportedly been exploring other options, including talks with Sweden about the Saab Gripen fighter jet. And Sweden's pitch isn't just about the aircraft. Sources indicate Sweden has been offering Canada something Canada has wanted for years: more real economic benefits at home, more manufacturing, more jobs, more production work happening inside Canada, not just contracts flowing out. In fact, the Swedish company has talked about bringing aerospace jobs and building real industrial capacity inside Canada. That kind of offer is exactly what many Canadian officials wanted from the F-35 program in the first place. But that's where the pressure ramps up again. The U.S. ambassador reportedly dismissed the Gripen as a weaker option, arguing it is not as interchangeable and not as smoothly connected with U.S. systems the way the F-35 is. In other words, the message is being framed like the F-35 fits the shared defense plan and other jets could complicate everything. And that's when this begins to look bigger than a normal purchase decision, because this is happening during a period where relations have already been tense. There has been harsh political talk, including public comments in the wider U.S. political world about Canada's status and U.S.-Canada trade disputes. Tariff threats have been discussed. Public trust has been shaken. Analysts say the overall tone between the two countries has felt colder than usual. And in that environment, turning a defense partnership into a public argument can create real damage. One defense expert has warned that public attacks like this can help America's adversaries because it shows cracks inside Western alliances. If the U.S. and Canada start fighting publicly, it can weaken the message of unity that deters rivals. Now let's step back for a second and explain what NORAD really is. NORAD was created in 1957 during the Cold War. Its purpose was simple: defend North America from threats in the air. Over decades, it became one of the most effective joint defense partnerships in modern history. It's based on trust, shared responsibility, and shared decision-making. But now many observers believe it's being used as a bargaining tool in a fighter jet deal. And that's where the worry grows. Because even if Canada does buy the F-35s, there is another major issue: true, Canada may not even be ready to use them. Reports suggest Canada's facilities to house and support these jets won't be ready until around 2031, but the first jets are expected to arrive earlier, around 2028. So what happens then? If the jets arrive and the hangars and support buildings are not ready, the aircraft could sit unused while the price keeps climbing, and every year of delay costs serious money. Now, how did Canada get trapped here? Because this story goes back more than a decade. Reports indicate Canada first joined the F-35 path around 2010. Early numbers were far lower, around $9 billion for 65 jets. Then, estimates rose again and again. Higher figures, bigger plans, shifting timelines. Now it's about $27.7 billion for 88 jets, and even that does not include everything Canada will need. The Auditor General's review reportedly found that earlier cost estimates used outdated numbers, older data, rather than newer, more accurate figures. That fuels the suspicion that Canada's true costs were not being shown clearly enough when key decisions were made. But here's the deeper concern. Canada isn't only buying aircraft. Canada is buying into a system. And that system includes software, maintenance networks, spare parts, updates, training pipelines, special equipment, and secure facilities, much of which is tightly controlled through U.S. channels. Analysts believe that creates a dependence problem, because if political relations ever get worse, that control could become a pressure point. In theory, access to spare parts can slow down. Software updates can become an issue. Support can become complicated. And if a modern fighter jet can't get what it needs, it can end up grounded. That's why, to some Canadians, the Swedish option looks attractive. The Gripen is used by several countries. It's often described as cheaper to run. Sources suggest it performs well in cold environments, and Sweden has strong experience operating in Arctic-like conditions. And supporters argue it would give Canada more independence. But U.S. officials seem to be signaling that independence comes with consequences inside the shared defense structure. Now, reports suggest Canada has already paid for 16 F-35s. Some of them are already in production, and money has already been committed to parts for others. That means Canada may not be able to walk away fully, even if it wanted to. So here's a real problem. What does Canada do with 16 F-35s if the original plan was 88? A fleet that small doesn't give full coverage. It doesn't provide the same defense capability. It could create training and maintenance challenges, and it can raise questions about meeting NATO responsibilities and protecting Canadian airspace. And there's also the economic argument. Supporters of the F-35 program say it creates large job benefits and long-term economic value. But critics point out that these benefits often depend on staying fully committed for decades at full scale. If Canada reduces the order, the economic projections could shrink fast. Now, Canada's leaders appear to be trying a new approach. Reports indicate Canada's industry leadership has signaled dissatisfaction with how much Canada is getting back from the deal. Some officials want stronger economic rewards, and they may use Sweden's offer as leverage. But renegotiating a deal this large is not simple, especially when the other side is sending public warnings, and the timeline is tight. Reports suggest the first set of jets may go to a U.S. base in Arizona for pilot training in 2026 and 2027. Then deliveries to Canada would begin around 2028, with final deliveries planned for the early 2030s. But again, if Canada's facilities aren't ready until 2031, what happens to jets delivered in the years before that? That's not a small issue. These are extremely expensive aircraft that need highly controlled support and storage. And then there's another growing concern: staffing. Documents and reports indicate Canada has faced pilot shortages for years. Even if the jets arrive on time, Canada needs enough trained pilots and crew to fly and support them. Some reports suggest this has been known since at least 2018, yet the gap has not been fully solved. So Canada is being pushed towards spending tens of billions on jets while still facing delays, shortages, and unanswered questions. And the U.S. position, based on public comments, is clear. If Canada doesn't supply the planned capability, the U.S. will adjust operations and fly more often to cover threats. That's why this story is starting to sound like more than a procurement problem. It's about sovereignty, because when a country's airspace and defense voice can shift based on what it buys, it forces a painful question. How equal is this partnership right now? One Canadian defense analyst has reportedly warned that public pressure harms shared deterrence and helps adversaries. And the logic is easy to understand. If Russia or China sees the U.S. and Canada fighting publicly, it can signal weakness, division, and distrust. NORAD was built during the Cold War as a partnership of equals. Both sides contributed, both sides benefited, both sides had a say. But critics now argue the tone is changing, that the message feels more like, do it our way or we'll do it ourselves. Officials say Canada's review of its fighter plan will conclude in the coming months, but the biggest question remains, what options does Canada really have? If buying the Gripen leads to warnings about altering NORAD and backing away from the F-35 leads to more U.S. operations in Canadian airspace, what path is left that protects both security and independence? The ambassador was reportedly asked whether he understands that some Canadians now see the United States as a threat. He reportedly rejected that idea. But the public debate is growing because many people are asking what counts as a threat. If a close ally ties a decades-old defense relationship to a weapons purchase, is that still cooperation or is it pressure? And then there's the Arctic issue. Canada's north is becoming more important every year. Russia has increased activity in the region. China has shown major interest and has described itself as a near-Arctic player. Analysts believe Canada will face higher pressure to protect and monitor its northern territory. Some reports raise questions about whether the F-35 has been tested to the same level in extreme Arctic conditions as aircraft designed and proven in cold climates. Supporters of the Gripen argue it is simpler to maintain, easier to support, and cheaper to operate in harsh environments. Meanwhile, the F-35 stealth systems and security needs require special facilities, special handling, and heavy infrastructure. One reason billions more are being added to Canada's cost. And Sweden's offer reportedly includes more than jets, potential assembly work, technology sharing, and jobs that stay in Canada. That's a huge contrast from the public U.S. messaging, which is centered on defense integration and interoperability. But here's the problem. This entire decision is being made in a political climate that has become toxic. When public talk includes trade fights and even extreme rhetoric about national status, it becomes harder to make a decades-long military decision based purely on trust. So where does Canada go from here? Let's break down the possible paths. 1. Canada buys all 88 F-35s. It accepts the higher cost, hopes the price does not rise again, hopes facilities are built on time, and hopes enough pilots can be trained. That is a lot of hope and a lot of dependence for the next 40 years. 2. Canada splits the fleet. Some F-35s, some Gripens. But that means two separate systems, two training pipelines, two maintenance chains, and higher complexity. In many cases, that can drive costs up, not down. 3. Canada sticks with the 16 already paid for and uses Gripens for the rest. But U.S. officials have indicated that would create major complications inside NORAD. And nobody has clearly explained what altered would look like in the real world. Would it mean more U.S. control, more U.S. flights, less Canadian influence, a different command structure? 4. Canada delays again, but every month adds cost. Every year adds huge amounts. And Canada's current CF-18s are aging out. Reports suggest the window is closing. So the reality is brutal. This isn't just about a jet. It's about what kind of relationship Canada and the United States will have going forward. A partnership where both sides choose together, or a structure where one side sets the terms and the other side adjusts? Analysts believe other allies are watching closely, because if the U.S. can pressure Canada this openly over one major defense purchase, what stops the same approach in other areas? Canadian leaders were elected in part on talk of reducing dependence on the United States and building more diverse ties. But this F-35 issue is the first major test. And right now, every option seems to come with a price. Either accept the deal and the dependence, or resist and face serious consequences in defense coordination. The U.S. ambassador reportedly said NORAD's mission should not change due to politics. But many people argue the way this is being handled is already political because defense policy is being used to influence a purchase decision, and the Arctic adds even more weight to the stakes. Canada needs the ability to defend its north, protect its airspace, and keep full control over its territory, especially as global competition rises in that region. These jets could stay in service for decades, possibly until around 2060 or beyond, meaning the choice today could shape Canada's security and independence for an entire generation. And the most troubling part may be the signal this sends. If this is how close allies deal with each other now, what does that mean for the larger Western defense system? What does it mean for NATO unity? What does it mean for smaller allies who might fear the same kind of pressure? Some reports suggest Canadian officials are frustrated that this is unfolding in public. They would prefer quiet talks behind closed doors. But the public pressure has already been applied, and now it's part of the story. So here's where we are tonight. Canada must decide soon. Costs keep rising, facilities are delayed, pilot shortages remain, political tension is growing, alternatives come with risks, and the future of North American defense cooperation is suddenly being questioned in a way few people expected. The ambassador says the U.S. is not a threat. But when the choice sounds like do it or face consequences, when airspace becomes a bargaining tool, and when a 70-year defense partnership is tied to one massive purchase, maybe the real question isn't whether a country is a threat. Maybe the real question is what kind of ally is willing to make a warning like this, and what happens next if Canada says no? What do you think Canada will do when the review ends and the pressure only gets louder?